Today we're going to look into the two main subdivisions of cells, which are prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. We've talked about cells quite a bit in the past couple of videos, but just the term cell is a very broad description because of how much variety there is in cellular life. So now as we divide the singular term of cell into prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, the first question is, what do these two new terms mean? The largest distinction between these two types of cells is that eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound structures, while prokaryotic cells don't have such structures. The most noticeable difference when you look at the two cells beside each other is the membrane-bound nucleus. So in eukaryotes, the genetic information or DNA of the cell is going to be inside of the nucleus, which is often known as the control center of the cell. However, in prokaryotes, there is no membrane-bound nucleus for the DNA to stay within, and so the genetic information of prokaryotes just floats around inside of the cytoplasm. Most of the time, all of the DNA will huddle into a portion of the cytoplasm, which would be called a nucleoid, but still not a nucleus, because a nucleoid is still not membrane-bound. So one thing to point out is that membrane-bound organelles are not the only difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. It's just the most noticeable. For example, there are some organelles that you will not find in prokaryotic cells that you will find in eukaryotes. These can be things such as mitochondria, which are found in both plant and animal cells, but both plant and animal cells are eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are normally bacteria or archaea cells, so the mitochondria are not found in prokaryotes. This is also the case in the Golgi apparatus, the nucleus, and the nucleolus as well. The nucleolus is not something we've gone over before and is actually located inside of the nucleus. Its main purpose is to produce ribosomal RNA, sometimes known as rRNA. So it basically creates an essential element to the process of protein synthesis in ribosomes, which will go further into the future. So as we now know, eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles and certain organelles as a whole that the prokaryotes do not have. But one other distinction is that in eukaryotes, the DNA tends to be in multiple strands, which is not the case in prokaryotes. So if you were to straighten out the eukaryotic DNA, you would get multiple strands of it, while the prokaryotic DNA would be connected into just one really long strand of genetic information. One other thing is that as you can see in these images, the eukaryotic cells tend to be much larger than the prokaryotic cells. This is because the prokaryotes are generally much simpler than eukaryotes, but still extremely complex, so don't get the wrong idea. So now that we know the four main key distinctions, what are some examples of prokaryotes and eukaryotes in real life? Well, eukaryotes include most of what we interact with on a daily basis. So this includes all multicellular organisms. So these can be animals, plants, fungi, and protists. Protists are particularly interesting because they look like they might fall under a type of bacteria, but in fact, they have membrane-bound organelles and are eukaryotic. Here we can see some images of eukaryotes under a microscope, and we can actually see that the nuclei of the cells have been stained so that they are visible under the microscope, which is really interesting. So since eukaryotic cells make up all multicellular organisms, all the visible life that you can see with just your eyes are all eukaryotic, because the single-celled prokaryotes would be too tiny to see. So what is prokaryotic? The easiest answer to that would be bacteria. All of the species of bacteria that we now know of are prokaryotes. However, one of the lesser known types of prokaryotes is archaea. Originally, scientists thought that archaea were just a type of bacteria that lived in extreme conditions. But after deeper research, we now know that they're an entirely different domain of life. Speaking of which, when we think of the domains of life, the current general idea is that bacteria and archaea are their own two domains of life, and the third domain is just eukaryotes altogether. Through these images, it can seem as though the domains of life symbolize a tree of life of some sort, which can be a good metaphor except for the fact that scientists are still unsure of which of these three domains of life began first, also known as the roots of the tree. Some may argue that the prokaryotes must have been first because they are simpler organisms, so they would have been easier to create. Some others argue that eukaryotes must have been first because since they're more complex, they've probably had more time to evolve, which makes them older. At the moment, there is no certain answer, and it's currently theorized that all three domains of life came from one common ancestor. So this is a very good example that humanity still has lots to find out in the field of science, and not much is really set in stone. The majority of science is built on theorization. This isn't to discredit why theories are used, however. Theories often have lots of evidence to back up its reasoning, which is why we use certain ones. It's just that theories are not certain. So hopefully this video gives you a decent overview of the differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells and their domains of life. The next video will be the last video on the cells unit, and then we'll start to expand to other fields of science along with biology. But for now, I thank you all for watching.